So when I listen to people like Senator Tommy Tuberville talk about, getting rid of all Muslims in this country, as an African American, I then say, what about white Christians? Because when we look at violence in this country, mass shootings in this country, who typically commits them? That's not true.
Well, that is true.
Okay, if what you just described is the case, then the Italians, the Jewish, the Polish, every group that came to the United States did exactly what you just said. They had own communities, own culture. So, do you understand the history of America?
When Roland Martin walks into a debate, it usually doesn't take long before someone's narrative starts to fall apart. And in this tense exchange on Piers Morgan Uncensored, Jillian Michaels learns that lesson in real time. What starts as an attempt to push fear-based talking points about Muslim extremism quickly runs into a wall of facts. Roland doesn't take the bait. Instead of matching rhetoric with rhetoric, he pulls the conversation back to reality, using history, context, and basic logic to expose just how shallow those claims really are. And that's what makes this moment worth watching from start to finish. This isn't just about scoring points or winning an argument. Roland completely reframes the discussion. He shifts it away from panic and stereotypes and toward accountability, consistency, and evidence. Once he does that, there's nowhere left to hide behind vague generalizations or emotional appeals. Before we break down exactly how Roland dismantles this narrative and why this exchange matters more than it might seem at first glance, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Do you think Roland was right to shut this down the way he did? Or do you believe Jillian raised points worth engaging with? Let's get into it.
Let me bring in Roland. Roland.
Piers,
you don't have an answer, do you?
Piers, Jillian, I've had to sit here and listen to y'all go back and forth. Can I please make this point?
Please.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Piers.
Yes.
Last week I was in Montgomery, Alabama for the 7th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott. And there is a National Memorial for Peace and Justice and Legacy Museum there that documents, that commemorates the documented 4,400 lynchings in this country. And there were more that took place. As an African American, when I understand what it means when you have a people who have a bullseye on their back, who are being targeted. I understand that. And so it is absolutely shameful that you cannot be at a Hanukkah celebration and it gets interrupted by mass violence because of two evil individuals. But I'm saying two evil individuals for a reason. Because under the legitimate FBI leadership of Christopher Wray, they said that the greatest threat in America is white domestic terrorism. So when I listen to people like Senator Tommy Tuberville talk about, getting rid of all Muslims in this country, as an African American, I then say, what about white Christians? Because when we look at violence in this country, mass shootings in this country, who typically commits them? And so I think anybody has to be very careful to not go down this path of, oh my God, all of them, when I, as an African American, who's also, Jillian, please allow me to finish. When I, as an African American, who's also a Christian, can literally look at the history of white Christians committing violence. And so what we cannot do is say, oh, it is the religion that's driving it, as opposed to it is these evil individuals. Piers, you properly talked about guns and how Australia, after that mass shooting, you said in the 90s, how they targeted. But the fact that they were successful should be a lesson to America. How about you also try that to deal with mass shootings in this country? And so it is wrong for us to go down this path of condemning an entire religion, condemning an entire group of people, whether they are Muslim, whether they are Jewish, whether they are Christian. What we have to recognize is there are evil people in this world, and our job is to root out evil and then how to impact people. But it's crazy to attack an entire religion and target all those people.
I agree with that. So my question is, what do you? My question, Wajahat, for you is, what does the Muslim community do to root out these extremists in their midst?
Right.
Well, okay, I'm going to
flip it understanding.
No.
By the way, everything you said, any white person who's committed such an atrocity should obviously go to jail for the rest of their life.
What has Jillian done to root out white mass shooters in America? Jillian, what have you done to root out and de-radicalize the white men in your community who are responsible for the #1 mass shooting in this country?
I would condemn and call it out, and I would, if I was on a jury, I would absolutely
what have you done?
vote for them
What have you done?
to go to prison. I'm also
And
not
that
doing
is the
anything
and that is
to go after radical Muslims.
Piers,
I'm trying to condemn all violence and form some common ground with you here, where radicalism across the board should be condemned. But I think what you're not understanding is when people are concerned, they're concerned, as far as I can tell, about assimilation. And in all the conversations that I have had about this, they are worried, like, hey, if it's 2 radical Muslims and 1 good guy, how are we going to keep the 2 radicals out? And if you've got, let's say, 1% of 2 billion people that want to bring down the West, like, what do you do about chance of death to America and Dearborn? This is what I'm saying. Like, what do you say about
I keep hearing
that?
assimilation. Piers, I keep hearing assimilation. And again, this is the point which you're making. You keep saying assimilation, that is the answer. Again, what happens when people who are born here, who were brought here in chains, and their ancestors and their folks are here, and you still are dealing with white domestic terrorism? Is that assimilation? See, this is the problem. Y'all somehow think that assimilation, that's going to be the answer. That's not. It is not the answer.
Well,
and so it's nonsensical to think so.
Well, it depends what you mean. I mean, look, let me
generally thrive in America.
Let them define assimilation.
Let me bring in Cenk here.
I'll define
Let me bring in Cenk.
I'll define it. It's not chanting death to America. It's loving America.
Hang on,
wanting
Jillian.
to pursue the
It's
American
also not
dream.
participating in a violent insurrection.
That's kind of the answer,
All right.
in my opinion.
Can I say something, please, to Cenk? So, Cenk, this word assimilation, what it really means to me, at its purest, is that if you come to, say, the United States or the UK or Australia from another country, particularly another country which has a very different culture. So say you come from the Middle East and you come to live in America, live in London, live in Sydney, whatever. The word assimilate means that you do your best to be part of the new culture you're joining. What you don't do is put a drawbridge up and start your own culture within the culture of the country you go to at the expense of that nation's culture. I mean, at its purest...
That's not true!
Well, that is true.
Okay, if what you just described is the case, then the Italians, the Jewish, the Polish, every group that came to the United States did exactly what you just said. They had own communities, own culture. So, do y'all understand the history of America?
Yes, and I also understand that in the
UK. What you described?
Well, I don't remember the Italians in America setting up their own rival court system, for example, unless I missed it.
Muslims haven't either.
Did they?
Yeah, no.
Because in the UK, we now have nearly 100 Sharia courts have been set up. Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't remember that happening with any of the Poles or the Italians in the United States. That's what I'm talking about, Cenk.
Okay. All right. So what I can't stand is the double standard. So if, for example, Jillian said, what if 10% Muslims are violent? Okay. If you said that about Jewish people and you said, look, I'm not worried about most Jews, but, if 10% of Jews are treacherous and serve Israel first and betray their country. Hold on. No, Jillian. Now you let me talk.
Gaza?
Okay? No, you let me talk. No. Okay. So now, if you said 10% of Jews are the real problem, everyone would be outraged, and rightfully so. That's not the right thing to say. But people say it blithely about Muslims, like we don't count, and it's no big deal to discriminate against us. Now let's talk about immigration. You fill out forms. If some idiot fills out a form and says, I'm for ISIS, I'm for Muslim extremism, and you don't want to let him into the country, of course you don't let him into the country. But now we're talking about Muslims at large. Wait, that's a totally different thing. By the way, are we doing the same thing for Israelis? Are we having them fill it? Hold on. Are we asking them to fill out a form? Are you against murdering 20,000 Palestinian kids? And if they say, no, I am for it, and I like what Israel did, are we banning them because they're sick, violent extremists who don't mind the murder of 20,000 children. No, of course not. In fact, when you look at the forms right now, what we're asking in entering our country is, what are your views about Israel? Who gives a damn what their views about Israel are when they're coming to America? Why are we asking about a different country? What I care most about is American sovereignty. Now, Roland is right. Muslims come here, Jews come here, Italians, etc. We all assimilate to some degree. I love the Pittsburgh Steelers. My favorite food is subs, etc. And I'm sure that's true of Jews, Christians, everyone, right? But we also keep a part of our culture. And if we said to, again, Jewish people, like we're saying to Muslims, how dare you not assimilate? What's with the silly hat and the stupid little things and the things coming out of your pockets? Why don't you assimilate? The real problem is the Jews. And they're too, hold on. And they're too loyal to Israel. And that's the real problem. They will not assimilate. All they care about is Israel. Everyone would say you're an unacceptable anti-Semite and you should be canceled forever.
Listen, I've got to wrap the debate. But
there's something genuinely striking about watching Roland Martin take apart Jillian Michaels on Piers Morgan Uncensored. Not because it's loud or theatrical, but because you're watching a fear-based narrative quietly collapse when it's forced to confront facts, history, and consistent moral standards. This isn't a viral gotcha moment. It's something more rare, a real-time demonstration of how anxiety-driven arguments unravel when they're no longer protected by vague generalities. Jillian enters the discussion armed with familiar rhetoric. She presents herself as the courageous truth-teller, willing to raise uncomfortable questions about radical Islam, framing suspicion as realism and fear as responsibility. It's a posture that shows up constantly in certain media circles, concern wrapped in the language of safety, marketed as honesty. But Roland doesn't engage on her terms. He refuses the frame entirely. Instead of arguing inside her assumptions, he resets the conversation from the ground up. When Roland references his visit to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, documenting over 4,400 lynchings, that isn't a tangent. It's foundational context, and it's context Jillian's argument simply can't withstand. Because once you confront America's long, well-documented history of religious and racial violence carried out by the majority population, the idea that Muslims represent some uniquely dangerous exception immediately falls apart. Roland never has to spell it out explicitly, but the message is unmistakable. He understands what it looks like when an entire group is treated as a threat. He understands what happens when people are judged collectively rather than individually, and he's not willing to watch that logic get recycled again under a different label. That's why his reference to FBI Director Christopher Wray lands so hard. This isn't ideological spin or activist framing. It's federal law enforcement, under Republican leadership, stating plainly that white domestic extremism poses the greatest threat in the United States, based on data. When Roland then brings up Senator Tommy Tuberville floating the idea of removing all Muslims and flips the question back onto the panel, what about white Christians? He forces the contradiction into the open. That's the moment Jillian tries to interrupt. And that interruption tells you everything. She knows exactly where the argument is headed. Roland insists on finishing his point, explaining that as an African-American Christian, he can look honestly at the history of violence committed by people who share his race and religion without concluding that Christianity, or white people, are inherently violent. That's the core principle she can't answer. You do not assign the actions of individuals to entire groups, ever. The standard has to be consistent. What makes Roland's approach so effective is his discipline. Jillian leans on fear, hypotheticals, and worst-case scenarios. Roland leans on documented history, institutional assessments, and data. She talks in abstract percentages. He cites what federal agencies actually identify as the primary threat. She casts suspicion over an entire religious community. He reminds everyone that this exact reasoning has been used repeatedly in American history, with devastating consequences. His comparison to gun violence and Australia's response cuts especially deep. Australia experienced a mass shooting, enacted meaningful reforms, and saw gun deaths plummet. The United States experiences mass shootings regularly and refuses comparable action. So if public safety is truly the concern, why obsess over a statistically smaller threat while ignoring a far larger, more immediate one? Roland never has to answer that question out loud. The answer is obvious. When Piers Morgan pivots to assimilation and claims immigrants create parallel societies, Roland dismantles that myth almost instantly. Italians, Jewish communities, Polish immigrants. Every group now considered fully American once formed tight-knit neighborhoods, preserved language, built institutions, and maintained culture. That wasn't a failure of assimilation. That was assimilation. That is American history. Throughout the exchange, Roland remains controlled, even when repeatedly forced to ask for space to finish his thoughts. No theatrics, no personal attacks, just sustained clarity. Jillian, by contrast, keeps cycling back to her prepackaged talking points, trying to pull the conversation back into a fear-based framework Roland simply refuses to accept. There's also intention in how Roland identifies himself throughout the discussion, as an African-American Christian. It grounds his argument in lived experience and makes clear that defending Muslims from collective suspicion isn't about political correctness. It's about recognizing patterns that any marginalized group in America should immediately recognize. This is the moral clarity that defines the exchange. Jillian tries to normalize broad suspicion. Roland insists on a principle so basic, it shouldn't be controversial. Judge individuals by their actions, not their identity. Confront violence wherever it exists. Don't punish entire communities for the crimes of a few. That's why Jillian never really answers Roland's arguments. You can't dismiss FBI statistics. You can't rewrite documented history. And you can't explain why collective scrutiny should apply to Muslims but not Christians without exposing the contradiction. By the end of the segment, Roland has done something rare on cable television. He hasn't just won the debate, he's changed what the debate is about. What begins as a discussion of a supposed Muslim threat becomes an examination of intellectual honesty, equal standards, and America's real relationship with violence. Instead of defending Muslims against suspicion, Roland puts suspicion itself on trial, and that's the real takeaway. Because once collective blame is accepted for one group, it becomes acceptable for all groups. History makes very clear where that path leads. Roland knows it, and by refusing the framework altogether, he exposes just how empty and dangerous it really is.